Woo! Okay.
Amazing. So we are live. Thank you all for joining us for our book club discussion with Professor Carol Anderson. I'm Gaby Goldstein. I'm Director of Research at Sister District Action Network, a nonprofit organization focused on nonpartisan education and advocacy, civic engagement, and all of that great stuff. Specifically, we educate voters about the importance of state and local elections, including through our book club, train new leaders, and conduct research to develop best practices to increase voter and volunteer participation and engagement. And we are affiliated with Sister District Project, a grassroots organization focused on building progressive power in state legislatures. And I'm so excited to be in partnership with All on the Line for our book club. And I'm here with Shehn, who will introduce herself and say a few things about All on the Line.
Hello all, my name is Shehn Datta. I'm one of the deputy campaign directors of All on the Line. We're on a mission to end gerrymandering. We believe very strongly that gerrymandering leads to polarization and dysfunction in our political system. So we're fighting back with and for communities like yours to make sure that gerrymandering is ended and that we achieve fair maps in 2021.
Awesome. So we are so excited to be here with Professor Carol Anderson to discuss her new book, which is our current book club selection. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Her research and teaching focuses on public policy, particularly the ways that domestic and international policies intersect through the issues of race, justice, and equality in the United States. Her newest book is One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. We were so thrilled to read another book of hers earlier this year, White Rage, for our book club, and are thrilled to be together again today. Thank you so much, Carol.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for the work you're doing. That's really important.
Oh, thank you so much. It's going to take all of us to keep this ship afloat and going. I loved this book. We were just chatting before we went live. We both loved it and hated it because I mean, it's such a powerful historical and present narrative about voter suppression. We have a few questions, a few sort of broad framing questions about voter suppression and venues of power, including state legislatures that have really been in the forefront of voter suppression tactics, and then a few more targeted questions around your specific chapters, voter IDs, voter roll purges, and the like, as well as the great chapter on Doug Jones's special election victory and what we can all as citizens be doing to help the cause of ending voter suppression and expanding the right to vote. So with that, I'll kick it off with just a few questions about some broad narratives that animate the book. And I think it's really incredible the way that you draw a through line from Reconstruction to the present in terms of how white elites have held back minority and especially Black access to the ballot. Just a few areas that come to mind in that sort of through line are felony disenfranchisement, which goes back to after the Civil War, tying Blackness to criminality through the narrative of voter fraud, that sort of thing. Would love your perspective on that through line historically that brings us from Reconstruction or before to now in terms of restricting access to the ballot.
Yeah, I think one of the key elements for me is what Mississippi figured out in 1890. And that was, with the 15th Amendment, you cannot write a law that says, we don't want Black people to vote. That is just even too blatant for the US Supreme Court. I mean, it just says, this looks like it violates the 15th that says the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what Mississippi did was say, we will take the societally imposed conditions on Black people and make those conditions the access to the ballot box. Mm-hmm. So we saw it with the literacy test. When you systematically underfund, defund, refuse to fund education for Black children, And then as they become adults, you say, you need to read the Constitution and interpret it. You have set the condition for illiteracy to then be the access point to determine whether you're going to be able to vote or not. The same thing with poverty and the poll tax. Well, when you look at where we are today, we have those same societally imposed conditions. Say that we know that we have a primarily working class population. So what we're going to do is to restrict early voting hours, and particularly on those days when we know that those populations come out in mass to vote. We're going to cut those days off. Say that we say you need to have an ID, but what we do is we restrict access to the places where you can get that ID, making it miles away, and then creating yet another barrier. Or we say we're going to move your polling places to be fiscally responsible, knowing good and doggone well that by moving those polling places, particularly in areas that don't have access to really good public transportation, that then those societally imposed conditions again then make access to the ballot box doubly difficult. All the while, without saying we don't want Black people to vote. So that's the through line there. It is a means to restrict the vote to those who have power, to those who have influence. It is a way to craft an electorate so that the politicians choose their electorate instead of letting the electorate choose their representatives.
Absolutely. Professor Anderson, it's interesting that you specifically talked about the Mississippi plan just now, because something that Gaby and I noticed is that so much of this is couched in neutral terms, right? It's not outright saying that there's something wrong with like, oh, we're not going to create this poll tax because it suppresses the right to vote, but saying, okay, well, like, it's neutral, it's fine. And we also were thinking about specifically the poison pills, as you call them, in HAVA or in motor voter law, which is the National Voter Registration Act. That here are these things that are expanding the right to vote on the face, but what we're sliding into the language is these poison pills. So what are some other examples that you could think of about this, like neutral language that is actually incredibly harmful?
You know, I think that those two really are powerful. And so I do want to talk about the Help America Vote Act, because here, coming out of that 2000 election, and we remember that 2000 election, we remember it because Florida, the hanging chads, the inability to count, the recount, the US Supreme Court coming in, stopping the count as it looked like Gore was closing in on Bush. And so we remember all of that. What we don't remember is Missouri. And with Missouri, you had almost 50,000 people illegally purged from the voter rolls before the 2000 election. When they came to vote, because they hadn't been informed, their names weren't on the rolls. And so all of the hours that it took trying to get them back on the rolls led the Democratic Party to sue to keep the polls open past 7 o'clock, because you had all of those folks downtown at the Board of Elections still trying to get back on the rolls after losing an entire day. Well, you had the Republicans hollering, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. This is an attempt to steal the election. This is an attempt. You've got dead people voting. You've got dogs on the rolls voting. That language, right? Ritzy Meckler. There was one dog on the roll, Ritzy Meckler. Okay. And Ritzy didn't cast a ballot. I'm just saying. And that language of voter fraud, which was a lie. All of the things that they were really bringing up as this massive, rampant attempt to steal the election did not happen. The vacant lots actually had homes built on them. 83% of them at least, right? The one dog who was on the rolls and the one dead person who was on the rolls. So they wipe out almost 50,000 people, but they leave the dead guy? Never mind. But it wasn't voter fraud. But that became incredible language that that snaked its way into the Help America Vote Act, which was designed to reinstill confidence in the American people after the debacle of the 2000 election, that our election systems did work, that they were viable, that they were reliable, that they were valid, all of those things. So you take the Help America Vote Act that's trying to deal with issues of the voting machines, trying to deal with the issues of like the police using basically checkpoint Charlies around the precinct in the Black neighborhood in Jacksonville, all of those kinds of things. And you take that reality and put it in federal law saying, we've got to fix this. And then you take the lie of voter fraud. And I mean a USDA grade A prime beef lie of voter fraud. And you insert that, which is what U.S. Senator Kit Bond did. You insert that into the Help America Vote Act and saying, well, we've got to stop all of this voter fraud. And this is where we get the language of voter ID. It sounds innocuous and it sounds viable and reasonable, except it's not. One, it's predicated on a lie. And two, then the way that they begin to craft that language is a way to really constrict and restrict access to the ballot box for American citizens.
Yeah. And it's so, this issue of giving federal credence to the lie of voter fraud is so powerful because it goes right back to the Mississippi Plan and the idea of election integrity being the neutral face of clearly discriminatory laws. It's so interesting just, to bring it to today with impeachment and the fact that Trump's approval ratings aren't really down very much, and the idea that broad narratives really matter a lot, and they're really sticky. And we've had this Republican or conservative, because they used to be Democrats, this conservative narrative around election integrity as the Trojan horse for suppression for hundreds of years.
Yes. So in fact, the Mississippi Plan of 1890 was seen as a progressive measure to end corruption at the ballot box, to bring integrity back to the election system, to the electoral system. And so in this way of ending corruption, what they identified basically were African Americans as the corrupting element in voting. And so how do we remove that corrupting element? And so then you have this wonderful language. So the literacy test, that language dealt with, it said, we believe that voters ought to know the values and the bedrock foundational principles of our society. So they should be able to read the Constitution, our founding document, and be able to interpret it. And it sounds reasonable. You want folks to know that this is a democracy and that there's some pillars in democracy. It sounds.
Sure, you just don't make any schools available,
right?
So,
okay, well, there's that, right? Or you do the poll tax where you say, elections are expensive. You have all of these, you got to have ballots and you got to have people who are taking the ballots and you got to have a place where their people are voting and you got to have people who are counting. It's really, so if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee in order to make sure that this democracy moved. So one of the things that happens, so, we talk about these kind of through lines. That's another one of the through lines, because what it does is it puts the responsibility for upholding this democracy, for upholding the right to vote on the shoulders of the individual and not on the state.
Which, by the way, is a classic neoliberal move, right?
Yes.
We see that in so many areas, right? It is a shift, a retrenchment of responsibility from the government onto the individual. So an interesting cross through line there.
So, if you really value democracy, you would be willing to stand in line. If you really value democracy, You wouldn't mind that we were trying to be fiscally responsible and shut down over 200 polling places here in Georgia. You wouldn't mind if you were really, if you, so by putting it on that responsibility for upholding the Constitution on the individual and not the state, it allows the state to completely abdicate responsibility and say, and it allows the state, like John Merrill in Alabama said, voting is a privilege. So when you turn voting into a privilege and not into a right, then that means you can put as many obstacles in front of that privilege, because it says in order to gain that privilege, you have to earn it. Now, and we do that disparately. So not everybody has to earn it. And that's where massive voter suppression also comes in.
Yeah, so I mean, it's so funny that this last conversation was about how commonsensical everything was, right? It seemed so easy on the face that, like, okay, you pay property taxes that then fund your schools or fund your post office or fund your libraries. And I think this brings me back to like how local it is, right? How everything is happening right at home in your own backyard. And so it becomes then about like local and state politics, right? And it's about states' rights. So can you talk to us about some examples of states' rights, as we call them, being used to suppress the vote?
Ooh.
That's a separate book, right?
So I was like, how long do we have to talk?
Maybe one example.
Okay. So for instance, I'm going to kind of snake through several of them, actually. Prior to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the things in the Voting Rights Act was like landmark legislation. What we had prior to that time were the states, particularly in the South, buckling down, bearing down, saying we control what happens in our elections, period, even in federal elections. And so they created a whole wave coming off of the Mississippi Plan so you had like the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause said, if your grandfather could vote prior to 1867, then you too can vote. Now, that date wasn't pulled out of thin air. 1867 was the Reconstruction Act of 1867 that basically said Black men can vote.
And before that, none of them could vote. So, like,
right.
So having a grandfather who could vote when no one could vote.
Right. So this was a way, if the poll tax, because the poll tax was lethal, the poll tax and the literacy test, they really wiped out a lot of whites too, poor whites. The grandfather clause was a way of letting some poor whites back into the electoral process. You had the white primary.
We had never heard of this. We were chatting beforehand. I mean,
never.
We got a lot of public education between us, and I mean,
nothing.
How did we never hear of this before your book?
And this is part of the way that voter suppression works. We often think of it in terms of the cataclysmic violence that we saw on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. That's how we think of voter suppression.
Right.
Bullwhips and horses and tear gas and beatings. But it's the bureaucratic violence where you see the millions of silent civic deaths that happen. That was the Mississippi Plan of 1890, and it spread throughout the South. They were so proud of that thing because it worked so well.
Yeah.
Of course you had election day terrorism, but to be able to knock folks out because they didn't have money, because they didn't have education, because their grandfather was enslaved, because they were Black and couldn't vote in the white primary. And the white primary, because the South was a one-party system that Democrats only, basically. And that's because Lincoln was a Republican. So They were like, oh, no, nobody does the Emancipation Proclamation. So So the way that it worked was, if only whites could vote in the Democratic primary, then whoever won that Democratic primary was really going to win the general election in November. So that primary was the real election. And that's where they were like, oh, no, we're not having black folks voting up in that. Now, the ones who can snake through everything else that we've done, if they can vote in the general election, fine. But it's not like the general election matters anyway. It's the primary. So you see these rules being written. And I mean, Texas took the lead on this one. Texas was like, oh, we got this. Mississippi, thank you very much for everything else you've done. We've got this. And so Texas, I mean, whoo, Texas barreled down on the white primary. First, they were like, okay, and then they wrote this law that said only white people can vote in the Democratic primary. The court said, okay, that's too much even for us. We told you, don't be that blatant. They're like, oh, okay. So then they came back and they had the Democratic Party. The state of Texas granted the Democratic Party the authority. And so the Democratic Party wrote, only white people can vote in the Democratic primary. The court came back and said, doggone it. Do I have to spell it out for you?
Let me teach you how to suppress the vote.
Right. Okay, so let me tell you how to do this. You don't give the Democratic Party state authority, because they're still acting in as a state entity when you do that. And so when they write, we only want white people to vote, that's like violating the 15th Amendment. So if the Democrats happen to have, their own little convention away from the state, you put up a little firewall. And in their little
private organization, and then they're not subject to these little constitutions.
Boom, right? And so, and I mean, this battle went on for years. Finally, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944 said, look, the white primary is unconstitutional. And the states went, really? Are you sure? And continue to fight it and continue to come up with different iterations, where you even have South Carolina. You were talking about what states do. So South Carolina decided, I know, we'll get rid of all of our election laws. That way, there will be no law on the books anywhere that any court can say is discriminatory. Ta-da! So
it's crazy. And these are all creatures of state law, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
totally.
Yeah, when we get to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in 1966, South Carolina, shocking, challenged the the Voting Rights Act of 65, saying that it violated states' rights, saying that because it banned the literacy test. And now there were federal electors sitting there in South Carolina's precincts, making sure that the poll workers weren't giving people the literacy test, that violated states' rights. And I'm like, no, they were upholding the 15th Amendment. So you see this the power of the state.
Yes.
Is really using its mechanisms, its laws, in terms of what I continue to call this bureaucratic violence.
Mm-hmm.
What we saw in 1940 was there were only 3% of age-eligible African Americans registered to vote in the South, 3%. When we're getting into the early 1960s, before the Voting Rights Act, there were some counties, in the Black Belt counties in Alabama, where it was 0% African Americans, but over 100% whites registered to vote.
Yeah.
Over 100%.
Totally. We read Ari Berman's book on this exact
Give us the ballot. Wasn't it beautiful?
Give us the ballot, yeah, for the book. And I mean, it's just wild because, you know, obviously there was this huge sort of narrative around states' rights as a mechanism to restrict the right to vote. Then you had the VRA, and then of course we've come full circle with Shelby County, which has now gone back, you know, eviscerated the VRA, getting rid of preclearance and sending so much of the substance of voting rights back to the states, and we're right back where we were in many respects. And I mean, one of the things that I'm obsessed with is the idea of a progressive federalism, the idea that we have ceded the sort of existence, or, you know, truly the existence of states having certain powers to the narrative of the right over, you know, hundreds of years. And of course, federal protections are incredibly important, but realistically, with the composition of the Supreme Court and the sort of the way that things are going, we have to be a bit more focused on a state strategy to encourage and expand the right to vote. And I think that you have some really excellent examples of ways that states are asserting their authority to expand the right to vote.
Yes.
You mentioned AVR and others, and I would be so curious for your thoughts about this idea of progressive federalism and the need to harness state power to advance a voting rights agenda.
Absolutely. I mean, so think about it. In Pennsylvania, one of the worst extreme partisan gerrymandered states, with some small percentage of votes ended up leading to 72% of the congressional seats. I mean, I had a common law prof who just used to say, "God love a duck." I mean, you just, and what you saw there was the state court stepping in saying, "Not today." Not today. Now, either you draw those maps according to the law, or we're going to draw the maps.
Right.
And you don't want the map that I'm going to draw. You know, it's kind of like when your mother says, "Don't
masters." That's right.
Right, don't make me have to come up there, right? So, so you have that. So that's why we have to pay attention to who's on our state courts. And really know what they value, who they are, what they have ruled on the past. So it requires us doing our homework. You have states like Oregon. Oregon was not satisfied. It had one of the highest voter turnout rates in the nation. And they said, "Is that all?" And decided we can do better. And came up with automatic voter registration, because they understood that one of the hurdles is that how do you register to vote really is very opaque. I mean, where do you go to do it? How do you do it? So they set it up where if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, you are automatically registered to vote. You have to physically, you know, say, "No, I don't want to be registered to vote," to opt out. That automatic voter registration, what that did was it increased the numbers of people who were registered to vote in Oregon. It increased the diversity of voters in Oregon, and it increased then the voter turnout in Oregon. California looked up. California, right? We think of California, but California is not. California had a 42% voter turnout rate. And Secretary of State Padilla went, Did you see what Oregon just did? Oh, we want some of that, right? So Oregon, California implements Oregon's plan, but ups it one more and says 16 and 17-year-olds will be pre-registered. Now, we begin to think about what that youth vote, that young adult vote can mean for transforming this society, because their vision about, I don't want the earth to burn.
Yeah.
Their Wow, their vision about, I really would like to be able to sit in my school and not have to worry about somebody coming in with military grade weaponry. That would be nice. So their vision, getting them actively engaged in the civic electoral process, transformative. We saw that in the 2018 election, where not only did we have the highest voter turnout in a midterm since 1914, we also had an exponential growth in that 18 to 25, 29 age group, where they showed up. They were like, oh, let's say we came to slay. And they did it. I was just like, yes. And so part of what we're seeing here in Georgia actually is in that age group. Georgia is leading the nation in increase in voter registration for that age group.
Stacey Abrams did an incredible job.
Right.
Yeah.
Hearts.
You saw, was it Illinois? Illinois said, okay, automatic voter registration is cool, but a lot of folks don't go to the Department of Motor Vehicles. Why don't we open it up to other agencies and make those agencies also the portal into voter registration? I mean, so you have these states who are thinking it through. You also saw in California, Lord, and when I'm quoting Arnold Schwarzenegger.
We love Governor Schwarzenegger down the line. He's like really trying to do something here.
He really is. I mean, when he said, there's more turnover because of gerrymandering, there is more turnover in the Soviet Politburo than there is in Congress. Lord, that's telling you something. And so he was jumping in both feet for a nonpartisan redistricting commission in California, so that because as you know, and I talk with my hands a lot, when the maps are drawn in certain ways, using like that Cambridge Analytica data, using all of this, that you can shape who your electorate is in such a way that, I mean, so Ohio has Jim Jordan. Had to take a minute there.
Oh yeah.
His district is like shaped like a duck, like Donald Duck, right? And that is to snake it around, move it around all of the urban areas. So he's got this thing that goes almost up here, somewhere near Cleveland, to almost down here, somewhere near Dayton. I mean, that's not even, come on. Or Ohio also has the snake on the lake, which goes from Cleveland. You can tell I'm from Ohio. Goes from to Toledo. And it's like, really? But you can tell that kind of district drawing had nothing to do with the will of the people. Totally. It had to do with how do we maintain power by silencing people's voices.
And I mean, gerrymandering is a creature of state law.
Yes. I mean, I talk about gerrymandering almost every day, if not also on the weekends. It's kind of a broken record at this point. And so, like, we talk about gerrymandering as like a key to suppressing the right to vote, but I think sometimes drawing that line through, and I mean, I think about voting rights a lot. I think about gerrymandering a lot. And I think the way you tied Shelby County directly to gerrymandering was really interesting, and it laid it out better than I'd ever thought about it. But like, can you talk about like, what are the consequences in the bigger picture of gerrymandering, especially when it comes to voter suppression tactics?
So one of the things is to understand that gerrymandering, as with all voter suppression, is designed to discourage voters from showing up at the polls. It is to make it so like it doesn't matter. And so what we know are, though, in those heavily gerrymandered places, boom, voter turnout is down. We know that. That's part of what it's designed to do, is basically to undermine democracy. The other way that it works is that it gives disproportionate power to certain areas in the state, and it dilutes power to other areas and voices in the state, to the point where you get more representatives representing fewer people.
Yep.
It's just like in 2016, I saw numbers that said gerrymandering had provided an additional somewhere between 16 to 26 additional congressional representatives for the Republicans in Congress, right? Yep. Then you begin to think about what 16 to 26 additional representatives can mean when you're discussing access to health care.
Right.
When you're trying to get the votes, what it can mean when you're talking about reasonable gun control, like taking these, military grade weapons out of the hands of civilians. What it can mean when you're talking about climate change and environmental protection. Those votes have warped federal policy. So even when you're in a state that's not gerrymandered, having these other states that are skewing federal policy where you live. I liken it to, I know this is going to sound weird, but I liken it to the antebellum America, where the slave states were so determined to have slavery just spread from sea to shining sea that they used all of their power, all of their bullying, and they got through the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which basically turned even states that did not have slavery in the North into slave catchers.
Mm-hmm.
Or they would be in violation of federal law. And they're like, Ohio and Pennsylvania were like, what? No. And you have South Carolina going, yes. Yeah. Wow, right? And it's that kind of skewing where you get the disproportionate power of the few.
Yeah.
Warping the value system and the laws and the quality of life for all.
Totally.
That's what gerrymandering does.
And there's like two pieces. One is just exactly what you said, which is that that gerrymandering creates a situation where in this case the Republicans have been able to extract so many extra seats, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The other piece is that because so many of the districts, congressional districts, but also state legislative districts, are drawn in a way that are uncompetitive, it allows the most extreme part of the Republican Party to take those extra seats. So it's a twofer. You get a 2 for 1. You get more seats and more partisanship in those seats at the same time.
Which leads to the function, right? Which leads to where we are now, which is where people see that this is a broken political system and that the issues, I mean, Professor, you just listed so many of them that like I talk about on a regular basis, like gun control, climate change. We literally are saying like they're all on the line. There we go.
They are all on the line. Yay! Right. And I think one of the other things, as you know, in late 2018, late 2018, Democrats in New Jersey, there were a group of Democrats in New Jersey that tried to push through an extreme partisan gerrymandered districting. Right. And you had progressives and other folks in the Democratic Party going, not today, Satan. That's not who we are. That's not how we roll. That's not what we do. Having a full-blown constituency within the party that can push back hard against this is essential. The problem is that does not exist in the Republican Party. Instead, what you had, think about Tom Hofeller, who was the map drawer. Thank God for his daughter, right?
I know. She should be on time the next time.
Oh my gosh. So, and you have him working in league with key members in the Republican Party to draw these hyper extreme gerrymandered maps, whereas he said it will be to the benefit, it will be advantageous for non-Hispanic whites and the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
So when that's your goal, is to figure out how do we deal with the demographic changes in America by, in fact, silencing waves, millions in that demography.
Yeah, which is something that you bring up in the book about one of the lessons learned from Missouri in 2000. It created both Florida and Missouri in 2000 created the sort of confusion that led to the rise in this, again, the through line narrative about election integrity, but also the fact that I think, as you put it, demography is not destiny.
Yep.
If you, or demographics are not destiny if you rig the rules, right? And I think that the Missouri sort of purges in that election gave the Republicans the kind of playbook that has allowed from hence so much more has come.
Right. I mean, when you think about it, it was the purges in Florida. 20,000 purged, overwhelmingly Blacks and Hispanics. When you think about the purges that happened in Ohio, where in one of those purges, 25% came solely out of Cuyahoga County, which is where Cleveland is. You think about here in Georgia, not only did we have these massive purges in Georgia, but we also had exact match, which was a way to keep folks off of the voter rolls. And so in 2018, in October of 2018, a month before the election, Brian Kemp, who was running for governor, but was also Secretary of State controlling the election process.
Georgia.
Hello. Withheld via exact match 53,000 voter registrations. 70% of those withheld were African American. This is, demography is not destiny if you can control the electoral machinery. And that, to me, those are two of the key lessons. The third lesson coming out of 2000 was to lie. Just lie like a bad toupee. Just lie.
Yep.
Woo!
I think what you just said about like exact match and the interstate cross-check is also so important, because what they literally used was our heritage, right? Like it's the last names that you feel so much affinity to that it like defines almost who we are, and they use that against us. And I mean, even like we talk about like, okay, this is all in the South, it's happening in the South, but Washington, I'm trying to remember Washington, another state that you listed, it was 1 million people who were purged. Washington is a progressive, it's a blue state. And I think about the demographics, it's Asian Americans, it's Latinos who got off the voter rolls simply because of your last name.
Hello. And so part of what I talk about in this book is in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. Part of what the broader narrative, you talk about those sticky narratives, is wow, 2008 and 2012, wow, how racist can America be? We elected a Black man to the White House twice. We put a Black man in the White House. Woo, aren't we good? Well,
Not quite.
That narrative basically says whites overwhelmingly voted for Obama, but the majority of whites have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964. Since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and said the federal government would enforce the citizenship rights of Black people. Since then, the majority of whites have not voted for a Democratic candidate. Obama got a lot of white voters. He didn't get the majority.
Hmm.
What he did was that incredible grassroots ground game, knocking on doors, getting folks registered to vote, getting folks to the polls. 15 million new voters showed up in 2008. Overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression.
Mhm.
So when we look at crosscheck, one of the things that crosscheck does is it's predicated on the lie of stopping voter fraud. You know, these people who are living in multiple states and hopping from state to state voting. So really, right? And so
but they were not.
right, but they work a lot, right? I mean, it's just like, really, dog? But what it's supposed to do is it plays to American sense about race neutral technology, right? This is just technology. So it says it's this huge database and we're going to check via first name, last name, suffix, junior, senior, last four of your social security and your date of birth. And if we find those parameters in Kansas and those parameters in Virginia, you're knocked off the rolls. But that's not how it works. They don't really look at social. They don't really look at date of birth. They don't care about the suffix so much. Kind of, sort of your first name, but Jose looks like Joseph. Right. That last name. And in 85 of the 100 most common last names in America, minorities are overrepresented in 85 of the top 100. So if your last name is Washington, there's almost a 90% chance that you're African American. If your last name is Hernandez, over a 90% chance that you're Hispanic. If your last name is Lee, over a 90% chance that you're Asian American. And so by perseverating, focusing in on that last name, you're able to take out 3 portions of that Obama coalition. Cross-checked has wiped millions off of the rolls. Whites are underrepresented by 8%. African Americans overrepresented by 41%. Asian Americans overrepresented by 31%. And Hispanics overrepresented by 24%. So when you have those kinds of numbers, this is how you change the demographics of the electorate.
And I love what the Greg Palast quote you have in there about it. This is a brand new Jim Crow. They're not going to use white sheets. They're using spreadsheets.
Boom! Yes, I mean,
yeah, I loved that. I love that. It's so true, and it's crazy that the match error rate on crosscheck was checked by not sort of impartial researchers and found to be 99%.
Yeah, when you get a 99% error rate, I'm kind of thinking, Houston, we have a problem. You know, you are the folks, I do not want you putting a spaceship in the air when you got a 99% error rate. And with a 99% error rate, I don't want you anywhere near our election systems.
I mean, or anything.
No,
God, it's
exactly.
99% of the time.
You know, you're wrong 99% of the time. So I mean, yeah, sit down.
Yeah.
So you saw that in a recent court decision, crosscheck, got banned, stopped in Kansas, the home of crosscheck.
The beast.
Right.
Yeah. Totally. And I mean, it's you're drawing it together so clearly, the clearly discriminatory impact and also intent, right, of a system like crosscheck and exact match. And it reminds me a little bit of AOC lately talking about airing the idea and sharing the idea that algorithms are racist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that the idea that data is neutral or that technology is neutral is a fallacy. And if it's kind of like the colorblindness that has infected so much of the jurisprudence all the way through, the Shelby decision, where Roberts, basically said that, oh, we're not racist. The South isn't racist anymore. We aren't either. We are racist. But but we have to face it head on that technologies and algorithms are not unbiased, and that we do not live in a colorblind society, and embracing, or not embracing it, but recognizing the truth of that and facing it head on can be much more productive than the alternative.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is why I like the groups that are, because it's really easy. It's really easy to look at all of this going, it almost feels like a blues song. Boom, 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 boom. You're right, but I looked at the December 2017 special election in Alabama, right?
Yes.
And here you had the state of Alabama applying every method of voter suppression in that state. It had closed over 60 polling stations, most of them in minority neighborhoods. It had voter IDs, and those voter IDs were really tailored and specific. So, for instance, as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund looked up and said, wait a minute, you passed a voter ID law saying you need government issued photo ID, but public housing ID isn't on your accepted government issued photo ID list. They're like, yeah, that's not a acceptable government issued photo ID. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And because 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African American. So if you can wipe that photo ID, government issued photo ID, off, you can really begin to depress Black voter turnout. Then you had the governor shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. And after massive protests, this was toward the end of the Obama administration, they managed to get them open for sometimes like for a couple of hours or a day, a month or something so you really have really limited access to, Alabama, and then you had massive felony disfranchisement. So in Alabama's Jim Crow Constitution that it wrote in 1901, it had language in there that if you have been convicted of a crime of moral turpitude, then you could not vote. Well, Alabama didn't want to define what a crime of moral turpitude was. So if you have been convicted of a crime, you've served your time, you get out, you want to vote. But if you vote and that crime that you had previously been convicted of somehow came under moral turpitude, but you're not sure, you could go back to prison for voting. So what do you do?
You don't
vote, right?
No.
So it took decades of lawsuits. Now remember, 1901, in 2017, Alabama finally defined crimes of moral turpitude. Murder, rape, treason, right? The biggies. By that time, 8% of Alabama's adult population could not vote because of moral turpitude. 15% of its Black population could not vote because of this moral turpitude voter suppression. So the organization, civil society, turned to Secretary of State John Merrill and said, whoo, with this new law, all of these folks that you told they couldn't vote, tell them they got their voting rights back. And he said, I don't think that's a good use of state resources.
Yeah, of course.
So you had civil society, and this is what I took away from that Alabama special election. Grassroots organizing, listening to the people who are there, who live there, who understand what their needs are, and that massive organizing and mobilizing. So you had, for instance, ACLU of Alabama and the Legal Society of Alabama heard and said, okay, fine. You don't think it's a good use of state resources? We got something real for you. And they were called restoration clinics. They sent out massive waves of advertising, and they realized that there was a demographic difference. So they played it on the radio and they played it on social media because, there are some folks who are like, social who? And there are other folks like, radio? What's a radio? So, but it said, if you have been convicted of a crime, there's a new law. You may have your voting rights. Come to our restoration clinic and let's find out whether you can vote. And they had a team of lawyers there going through the records. And then they had a team of volunteers going through getting folks, this is what you're going to need to register to vote. Let's make this happen. Let's make this happen. There were some folks, and these were set up in churches, but they knew that there were some folks who weren't going to step foot in the church. They had caravans going around to poor neighborhoods where with alerting them with all that massive advertising. Thousands were getting registered to vote in this process. They had the NAACP of Alabama was an information hub because so much was inaccurate. This is your new polling place. This is when you can vote. This is the deadline for this. Getting that information out at class reunions, at family reunions, at barbecues, at the whole, just there. They had set up because the polling stations had been closed. And what we know is that for every 10th of a mile that a polling station is moved from the Black community, Black voter turnout goes down by 0.5%.
Wow.
Yeah, so up to 4 miles. So you can, if you move it 5 miles, you have done a 20% drop.
Wow.
Yeah. So what they did was they set up something like the Montgomery bus boycott private car system.
Mm-hmm.
And they had cars picking up folks, taking them to their polling stations, getting them back home, picking up somebody else. I mean, it was just so on. And remember, this is when Doug Jones is running against Roy Moore.
Yeah. Right. I mean, what can anyone say about Roy Moore?
There's nothing to be said.
No.
But it looked like all the polls showed Roy Moore was going to win this thing, despite everything, because that is the power of white supremacy. And that's what we have to understand in this, right? So as the votes are coming in from Northern Alabama, it's just Roy Moore, whoop, Doug Jones, Roy Moore, that was Huntsville, Roy Moore. And then I remember seeing this tweet because I'm watching, right? I'm watching. And this tweet comes in from Bernice King. And she, Reverend King, Martin Luther King's daughter. And she tweets, boom, Selma, Lord Selma. And the votes had just come in from Selma and flipped that thing. I mean, it was just.
I just got goosebumps listening to it.
I know, it was just. And it just kept rolling. So at the end, John Merrill thought that about 25% would turn out. Actually, the voter turnout in that special election was 40%.
Amazing.
In the Black Belt counties where all of that voter suppression had happened and where the people were rising up determined to be free, 45%.
Incredible.
Yes.
With local organizing, right? I mean, the thing that I really so much appreciated about your chapter was that you really centered the folks who are in Alabama and organizing there. And I think highlighting some great national partnerships, right? But it's the folks on the ground, the impacted communities that really put in the work over many years to bring that result to bear.
Exactly. I mean, because this is the stuff that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
Right.
This is people being there, listening to your neighbors. And I mean, that was one of the things that they did. They said, how do we, it's not like, okay, turn out to vote. They were like, what do you want? What do you want? And as they started talking about good schools, They started talking about access to healthcare. They started talking about, a quality of life. Then they're like, okay, and this is how this is linked with the vote.
Yeah.
So listening to your neighbors and then linking up how different politicians, how different policymakers can make the difference in the quality of life. Boom. Yeah.
Totally.
And I've got a meeting.
Oh yeah, no. Thank you so much. This has been a delight as always. So grateful for your time and your scholarship.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the work you do so much. Thank you.
Bye.